It's not exactly news that athletes use steroids to make them tougher and stronger, to give them the extra edge that nature's denied. What is known is that steroids can cause side effects: heart disease, liver disease, sexual dysfunction. What's not so widely known is that steroids also increase aggression and anger, qualities which may enhance, say, a weightlifter's competitiveness or a linebacker's fierceness. What they may do to him off the playing field's another matter. If the athlete's a cop, the side effects, as we will see, can be tragic. We talked to 3 former police officers, all of them weightlifters, all of whom used steroids on the job. Freddie Gasca was a Miami policeman.
I would definitely not want to be stopped by police on steroids.
In Oregon, Glenn Woolstrom was a deputy sheriff.
Sometimes I felt extremely uncontrolled with my temperament.
Vincent Bovino was a cop in New York. One day, as a practical joke, some fellow officers decorated his car. He went into a rage.
And I pulled out my gun. And it was an intimidation factor, but that wasn't me at all. And, I mean, not that I was going to shoot the other cop, but I just wanted to let him know that I was serious about him not screwing with my car.
The short temper the steroids give you, the aggression, the hey, you know, I'm not taking anything from you, it's dangerous. It's dangerous.
It is plenty dangerous just being a policeman.
You are ordered to disperse.
At any moment, he may be forced into a volatile situation, split seconds away from mayhem. He is trained to try to keep the temperature down, to put up with both verbal and physical abuse, to use force as a last resort, to, above all, control his own temper. Vincent Bovino, policeman and bodybuilder heavily into steroids, was on duty at a welfare office when a woman began shouting abuse. Instead of calming the situation down,
I wound up grabbing her, throwing her across the room, jumping on her back, and handcuffing her. And it was just rage, because I had been provoked over a period of time, and I got pushed over the edge.
Did that shake you, that experience?
Definitely. Definitely, because immediately afterward, you replay it in your mind like a movie, and you don't even recognize yourself. You say, that's not me. That's not me. And it's a very uneasy feeling, knowing that you could be out of control.
Vincent Bovino was a Nassau County, New York police officer for 13 years. Today, he does not use steroids, and he is no longer a cop. In 1987, he was arrested for selling steroids and needles. The charge was reduced to a misdemeanor, and he was fined $700. He did not go to jail and never named the names of the dozen or so cops who were his customers.
A policeman on steroids, you don't have to worry about him shooting you. What you have to worry about him is hitting you with a flashlight over your head so hard that he's going to kill you.
Freddie Gasca should know. He was with the Miami PD until 1986, when he was fired while under suspension for using excessive force. There was a hardcore group of weightlifters in the department who were involved in a number of outrageous incidents, including the beating to death of one suspect. There was Officer Scarface Garcia, a dedicated lifter, steroid user, now wanted by the FBI for drug dealing and plotting to kill witnesses. The Miami PD, like most departments, ignored the steroid connection, even commended officers who were in good shape, and only acted when the violence became intolerable. Freddie Gasca started on steroids just after joining the force, and knew of at least 40 other officers who were regular users. But were you openly using it, talking about it? Or
Sure,
was it a
sure.
big secret?
No, no. You can't keep it a secret. You put on 35 pounds of muscle in a period of 3 to 4 to 5 months, and there's no secret about it. Everyone knew who we were. They joked about it. Supervisors joked about it.
Were you taking them right on the job, the steroids?
Sure. I had them in my patrol car. Other guys had them in their patrol cars. They would call me by sometimes when they didn't have any and say, hey, I left mine at home. And I would give them a few of mine.
Did you notice mood or behavioral changes in other cops?
I'd noticed them in myself and them. And we would talk about it. And we would try to control it to the point where if we felt something coming on that we were going to lose control, like in any situation, we would back off and try to have another officer take over.
Somebody not on steroids?
Hopefully. or somebody sitting in the background that's on steroids that wasn't to the point where you were?
We began to experience more incidents of prisoners being beaten, prisoners being physically abused.
Richard Witt is now chief of the Hollywood, Florida Police Department. But 3 years ago, he was in charge of training for the Miami PD.
We had incidents reported of police officers becoming very physically aggressive toward individuals who had done things as simple as refusing to sign a traffic citation.
Many of the steroid users who I have interviewed described precisely similar events where a minor provocation, a minor incident, would suddenly cause them to flare up and become unexpectedly violent.
Dr. Harrison Pope is an associate professor of psychiatry at Harvard. He is one of a handful of researchers who've looked into the effects of steroids on behavior.
In some people who are particularly predisposed to these effects, they experience what we call manic symptoms, racing thoughts, and reckless acts and impairment of judgment.
Glenn Woolstrom, now serving 20 years in prison, may be a textbook example. He was a deputy sheriff in Clackamas County, Oregon.
He was a man who showed no evidence of any major psychiatric disorder, no evidence of violence, no criminal record. He's a man who you wouldn't have hesitated to have babysit for your children. But when he went on steroids, he experienced a striking personality change.
Woolstrom was a man obsessed with weightlifting. He began what users call stacking, injecting or taking orally these 3 steroids: Anavar, testosterone, and Dianabol. Almost immediately, he became violent at home.
A few weeks later, a few weeks further into the steroid cycle, Glenn Woolstrom was on his way to work when his car started overheating. He pulled into this feed store to ask for some water. Leslie Myers, one of the owners of the store, told him where he could find the water. Then he asked her if he could use the telephone. He wanted to call the sheriff's office to tell them he'd be a few minutes late for work.
She told me where the phone was, and she made a comment that I should charge all you cops for using this phone. You come in here all the time, and I took it as a derogatory remark.
At 9 the next morning, dressed in his workout clothes and carrying his .357 Magnum service revolver, he came back to the feed store just as Leslie Myers was opening for business.
He was in a rage. At gunpoint, he forced her into his car and drove off.
I felt that at the time I really needed to teach her a lesson, and that's what was on my mind. And I felt emotion in the car, and I remember at that instant grabbing my handgun and pointing it toward her, and a shot was fired.
But you shot her?
Yes.
He shot her in the back. She fell out the open door, and he drove away.
I felt that it had not really occurred. At least in my mind, I thought, I have to be dreaming this, that something may have happened, but this just can't be true.
It was brutally true. That one shot left Leslie Myers paralyzed for life. Woolstrom was arrested a few hours later by a friend, Detective Jim Stroving.
And he said, as he threw up his hands, he said, "All right, I knew I couldn't get away with it. I'll tell you what you want to know." And then a moment passed, and he said, "It's those steroids. It's those steroids."
A blood test showed Woolstrom had 50 times the normal level of testosterone in his system. Dr. Douglas Johnson, a psychiatrist, examined him a few days after the shooting and ultimately testified in his defense, stating that the steroids, not Woolstrom, had pulled that trigger.
One could fairly ask, if he knew the steroids were doing something dreadful to him, why didn't he stop taking them?
Mm-hmm. They also did something so powerful for him, made him feel so good and so strong, and fulfilled a need that he had, that he really just wasn't at that time able to give them up, and I'm sure he did not foresee the consequences.
The judge was impressed by Dr. Johnson, but not convinced. He said, "I can accept and believe that these drugs induce hostility and aggression, but he could not accept that steroids made Glenn kidnap and shoot Ms. Myers." In sentencing Glenn, the judge did say much good can be said of this man. His career speaks for itself. His record is spotless. and cannot be ignored. But he did sentence him to 2 20-year terms plus a 5-year term, all to run concurrently.
If I could just turn the clocks back and, you know, wish this that never happened. It's just, I just can't tell her enough how sorry I am for what I did.
And those words again of hers were?
I should charge you cops for coming in here using my phone all the time. And it's so peculiar because that shouldn't upset anybody over some statement that really didn't mean anything.
Did he genuinely go from this meek, mild-mannered young man into a monster?
I am convinced that he did have a real Jekyll and Hyde change from the steroids, both from my own interview of him and from conversations with other people who knew him. He never showed any instance of this aggression and irritability prior to steroid exposure.
Have you kept in touch with your friends in the force?
Some of them.
They still on steroids?
Some of them.
Many?
A few. But I also, I'm around the courthouse. I see policemen, and I've seen many policemen that are or have been on steroids because I can tell by their size.
The only kind of action that could have been accomplished reasonably would have been through drug testing, so that it was provable. That's a very expensive process, and I'm afraid that not only the Miami Police Department, but that most police departments couldn't afford it.
The fact is, police departments generally turn a blind eye to steroid use. In Texas, 7 state troopers caught using or dealing in steroids barely received a slap on the wrist. And the same kind of tolerance of steroids by police is common around the country.
Okay, folks, Jeff Ashford, 600 pounds.
Here at the National Police and Firemen's Powerlifting Competition in Virginia Beach in September, the event was an open event. That is, no testing for drugs, despite a movement by an increasing number of bodybuilders and lifters to proclaim their competitions drug-free. We would not presume to tell you which of these cops might or might not be on steroids, but former police officer Bovino told us that anyone who takes the sport seriously can tell a steroid user just by his physique. He says he's out of the steroid business, but his new business is selling a book called the Underground Steroid Handbook, how to use them once you get them. And if they were legal, he says he'd be back on them tomorrow.
I think that I would be using them to my benefit under a very controlled situation, and I feel I have a lot of experience with that.
But you were a cop long enough to know that every junkie says that. I can control it.
Pretty much, yeah. That's true. It's just, when you're talking about athletics, bodybuilding and things, bodybuilders don't see themselves as junkies. Olympic athletes don't see themselves as junkies.
While the law currently regards the illegal distribution of steroids as a serious crime, last week a bill was introduced in the Senate that puts steroids on a par with cocaine and heroin. To get an idea of just how wholesale is the illegal use of steroids, listen to these numbers. Last year, American doctors and veterinarians legally prescribed steroids with a value of less than $10 million. But in that same year, steroids with a value of something like $500 million were manufactured here or imported into this country, and one way or another were made available to users. To get them, we're told, all you have to do is ask in practically any gym in the country.